Oh, there it is. Okay. We good? Okay. So my name is Ariel. I'm from the Immigrant Legal Services Center here at UC Davis. And today we're going to be going over some know your rights / know your power information related to immigration. So just before we jump into this information, I want to acknowledge that it is pretty heavy information. Some of what we're going into may hit differently for different people who may have personal experience with this or know someone who has personal experience with immigration enforcement. So before we do that, I just want to encourage everybody who is participating today to take a deep breath, center yourself, feel grounded, and check in to make sure that you're prepared to engage with this information today. And also just acknowledge that anytime anyone feels like they need to log off, that's totally fine. We are recording this presentation and we will distribute it after the presentation's over. So you can always come back and reference this information. So first, who I am, who the center is. We provide free immigration legal services to UC students and their family members, which includes spouses or fiancés, siblings, parents, and also children who are undocumented. So we provide services at all the UC campuses except UC Berkeley, and I am the fellow for UC Davis. So this is me, and I'm here. I started relatively recently, and my coworker Damian has been here for a couple of years. He's not a dog, he's a very lovely human, but this is the picture he chose to represent himself. So you can schedule a consultation with me at this link, and we'll provide it again at the end. But that's us. Now, just a disclaimer before we jump into the Know Your Rights portion of this presentation. This presentation is informational only. It is not legal advice. If you would like specific legal advice about your case, you should schedule a consultation with me or reach out to another immigration attorney. So why do we like to hold these presentations, and why is it important to know your rights? I like to start with this quote by Bruce Lee, or some people say it's by some Greek person, but I like to think it's Bruce Lee. We do not rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. And to me, this means that when we're in an emergency situation and we are like fight or flight response kicks in, we never act in the best possible way, in the most logical or rational way. We fall back to the responses that we've internalized and trained ourselves to have. So in an immigration enforcement sort of emergency, it can be very dangerous to react in an emotional or overwhelmed sort of way. And it's much safer to sort of train yourself how to respond and confront these situations before you ever are in them. So we'll jump into some of this information and identify sort of things that you can practice and all the things that you need to know to prepare for an immigration enforcement encounter. So what rights do you have? In the United States, everyone, regardless of immigration or citizenship status, has constitutional rights. These rights include the right to remain silent. However, you have to say that you are exercising this right. It doesn't just attach because you're silent. So if you want to remain silent, which you should in an interaction with ICE or other immigration enforcement officials, you should say out loud, I wish to remain silent. I don't want to answer any questions. I want to exercise my right to remain silent, something like that. You also have the right to refuse consent to a search of yourself or your car or your home, any sort of private space. You do not have to consent to these kinds of searches, and you should affirmatively say that again. ICE is not allowed to enter private spaces without a valid warrant. And we'll go in a little bit later about how to tell the difference between a valid or an invalid warrant. And I'll just spot some tricks that ICE likes to throw out. But it's just, they might ask you for permission to enter these private spaces. They might demand entry, but unless they have that warrant, you have a right to refuse consent. You have a right to say, I don't want you to enter my home. And if you're not under arrest, if you're not actually being detained, you have the right to calmly leave the situation. You can ask, am I under arrest? Am I being detained? And if the answer is no, you have the right to walk away. You also have the right to a lawyer if you are arrested or if you are detained. And if you're in immigration detention, you don't have a right to a free lawyer, but you do have the right to counsel. So you can ask immediately to contact an attorney. Hold on. At work, this can look a little bit different. So ICE is allowed to enter any public place, just like anyone is. So if you work in a public place, they can come into your workplace. For this reason, if you have coworkers or you work in an environment where you feel safe, it's a good idea to make a plan with your coworkers in case of an ICE raid. And an important thing is if this does happen, you should try not to run. Try not to panic and run outside or away from the officers. This is a great way to draw attention to yourself and put yourself at risk. If you can, just calmly continue working and leave at the first opportunity without drawing attention to yourself. If you unfortunately do get detained, you still have a right to remain silent and you still have a right to ask for an attorney. And your employer is required to inform you before there is an audit of I-9 forms. So if that's an issue for you, you do have a right to be informed and prepared. You also have some responsibilities in these situations. Most importantly, or first, you should try to stay as calm and polite as you can. Again, it's all about drawing attention to yourself. It's all about provoking or trying to avoid provoking any kind of reaction. So try to remain calm and don't try to interfere or obstruct or confront any police or enforcement officials. And importantly, never lie to immigration officials or the police. If you can be evasive, you can refuse to answer questions directly, but try never to give false information to immigration enforcement officials because it can have very severe immigration consequences down the line. There are huge penalties for making misleading statements to immigration officials. It can prevent you from ultimately getting immigration relief even years down the line. Never agree to a search, make ICE work for it, make them have to go out and secure the correct type of warrant, which can take time. They might not be willing to do it. So just don't make it easy for them. Don't agree upfront to let them search you or your car or your home. If you can, remember the details and write them down after it happens. This can be helpful for sharing with your attorney to make sure everyone knows why you're being pursued and what can be done to hopefully help you out. And then do prepare yourself and your family before you encounter immigration officials. And we'll talk a little bit more about things that you can do for that specifically. So a little quiz first. And since there's not very many of us, I don't think we'll do the whole poll, but I will just read through these and discuss the answers. So if ICE agents question you about your immigration status while you're at your home, what should you not say? A, I am exercising my right to remain silent. B, I came to the US legally. C, I do not agree to a search. D, do you have a warrant? Or E, am I being detained? The answer here is B. And this is a little tricky. It does assume that you are undocumented. But B is incorrect because first, you should never volunteer information. So you shouldn't tell them how you came to the US or tell them what your immigration status is, just without any prompting or anything. You should refuse to answer questions and refuse to volunteer information. And second, you should never provide false information. So unless this were true, you should definitely never say it to immigration officials. Question 2, if you are detained by immigration enforcement, what should you do first? A, ask to call your family members. B, ask for an attorney. C, say nothing and unquestionably comply with all orders. Or D, volunteer information about your immigration history. Now, we talked already that you should not volunteer information, so D is clearly incorrect. But the correct answer is actually B again. Ask for an attorney. Let that be the first thing that you say. Because until you ask for an attorney, they don't have to help you get an attorney. And without an attorney, it's unfortunately, very difficult to navigate the immigration system once you're detained. So hopefully in the future, you'll have a chance to call your family members. And of course, you shouldn't say nothing. You should definitely say that you're exercising your right to remain silent and those other things that we talked about. Great. There's the answer. So a little bit more information. A lot of people, unfortunately, are at risk or vulnerable to immigration enforcement, more than you might think. So anyone without lawful immigration status is always at risk, but even people with lawful immigration status, such as green card holders or visa holders, might be at risk if they have certain criminal convictions. So it's important that anyone other than US citizens have a plan for ICE arrest. Think it through so that the plan is in place and you don't have to scramble when there's an emergency. So even if you have, just to reiterate, even if you have legal status in the US, certain criminal convictions can pose issues for your immigration status, even if it's from a long time ago, even if it seemed really minor, you didn't go to jail, you just paid a fine, or you've been a green card holder for your whole life. Once again, unless you're a US citizen, you should seek legal advice from an immigration attorney anytime you have any criminal issues, or if you have any criminal history at all. It's very important. Okay. So what to do if you encounter ICE on the street? Sometimes ICE will wait on the street outside of homes or follow people or try to be really sneaky about how they get access to people in public spaces. So here are a few things that you should always say, and we've talked about this in a couple slides ago, but I want to reiterate it again. If they stop you and you notice that someone is an immigration enforcement official, maybe they're asking you questions, you should say, am I free to go? Because they have to tell you if they're not detaining you, and then you can walk away, as we discussed. If they say you're not free to go, you can still say, I don't want to answer any questions, and I want an attorney. Those two things. You still don't have to answer any questions. And unfortunately, if they say no, you're not free to go, that does mean that you're being detained. But you should still exercise your rights to remain silent, to have an attorney, and to deny consent to a search. You should also mention to them if you have medical issues or childcare issues that you need to talk about, and they should make accommodations for you to help with that. And yes, again, always refuse consent. So it's important to practice these lines over and over again until you feel comfortable with them, because in that emergency situation, you're going to fall back on what you know. And if you've practiced these enough, it will come naturally to you to be able to recite these things that are very specific and sound kind of unnatural, but are really magic words to help your rights come into force. So what if they're at your door? You should not open the door. Don't open the door to ICE. Instead, talk to them through the door if you can. Ask them to identify themselves. If they just say they're police, ask them to clarify what police. If they say they're from DHS or ICE, they're immigration enforcement. And then demand a warrant before letting them into your home. If they don't have a warrant, they don't have to be there. Like, you can refuse to let them in. But again, you don't want to open the door because that can imply consent for them to enter. So ask them to put it under the door, put it through your mail slot, and look at the warrant, which we'll discuss how to evaluate that in just a minute. And then if they're persistent and they keep asking questions, you can tell them to leave their contact information and say, I'll get back to you with answers. And then at that point, I would recommend going to speak to an attorney and not calling them back until you do that. And just to reiterate, to not lie. If they insist on knowing where someone is, and it's your dad and they're at work, you don't have to say, oh yeah, no, they're working at the shop down the street, go left on Main. You don't have to say that. You can say they're not home. That's not a lie. But it's not disclosing information that could endanger your family member. So just be careful how you answer their questions. And you can always say, I'll let you know, give me your contact information. But it's an important thing to note. I hear of people giving out this advice a lot about not opening your door. And I think it's important to note the sort of practical barriers we might not think about to that. For example, can you see who's knocking on your door before you answer it? If not, you might want to install a peephole or a window or something in your door. Do you have a way to pass documents through your door without opening it? If not, you might want to get a mail slot or figure out if you can slip things under your door, things like that, because those are the kinds of things that you don't want to be figuring out in the moment. You want to be prepared for to keep yourself safe. Okay, what if they're inside your home? So at this point, they've knocked on your door, you've opened it, they've walked into your home, and now suddenly they're here. The most important thing is that you repeat, I do not give consent to you being inside, please leave. Just repeat that, just keep saying it until they leave. Because without your permission, they're not supposed to be there, and you can revoke permission that you gave before. So if you open the door and you say, hi, come in, and they walk in, and then you realize they're ICE agents, you can say, I don't give you permission, leave my home. And they're supposed to leave. If they continue walking around and they start touching things, they start taking things, they start taking pictures, just reiterate that you don't consent. I don't consent to you photographing that. You don't have my permission to take that. You don't have my permission to do what you're doing right now. If you keep saying it, it builds up your case that they violated your rights, which can make it more difficult for them to build a case against you. So even in that situation, it's still so important to express that you're asserting your rights. But on that note, I think it's important not to leave things lying around that you wouldn't want ICE to see. So keep your identity documents and any sensitive items that might reveal your immigration status out of plain view when you can. Somewhere safe, of course, just in case ICE officers come into your home. You don't want to see all of your information just lying on the table where it'd be really easy for them to take a picture of it really quick. So thinking ahead about stuff like that's important. Okay, so let's talk about warrants. And this is pretty complicated and very tricky. ICE likes to be very tricky about this. So it's important to know what a real warrant looks like and know how to identify a fake warrant. So here are the requirements for when a warrant is valid. So if ICE has a valid warrant and they're standing at your door, that means that you have to let them into your home to conduct a search. So a valid warrant is one that's issued by a judicial court, which in California will probably say something like Superior Court of California or U.S. District Court of Northern California, not the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Justice or something like that. It will be signed by a state or federal judge or a magistrate, not an immigration judge or an immigration officer. So if it says too much about immigration on the warrant, it's probably not a valid search warrant. It's probably something else. It also has to have your correct name and address. So if your name is wrong or your address is wrong or it's missing, they can't search you. They can't search your home. Sorry, they gotta go correct it. They gotta go fix it. So check that because they get that wrong all the time. It also has to be current. So warrants are often issued the same day that the officers show up to someone's house, or maybe the day before or something. They're not going to be issued from weeks ago or months ago or years ago. So they have to be current. And some of them also have like execution dates or expiration dates, and that should be correct. If it says, you know, August, you say, come back with an unexpired warrant, come back with a warrant that's, you know, current for today. I'm not letting you into my home until you have that. And then another way to tell, it's usually called a search warrant. Often these invalid warrants will be called like warrant of removal and deportation or immigration warrant or something like that. So that's a red flag. So let's do a little bit of a test to test your knowledge and see if you can identify whether a warrant is valid. So here's the first one. Sorry, it's a little blurry. I'm hoping you can see it. But just a second, you can see it says at the top, U.S. Department of Justice, Immigration and Naturalization Service, warrant of removal, deportation, 20 officer of the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service, blah, blah, blah. Imagine it was filled out, of course, full name, place of entry, and then a signature of an INS official at the bottom. Okay, so this is not a valid immigration warrant. And I've highlighted some of the red flags. So you can see at the top, this is issued by the US DOJ, not by the Superior Court of California or another judicial court. It's called a warrant of removal, not a search warrant or something like that. It references the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service. Today, this would probably be the US Citizenship and Immigration Service. That agency has changed names, but yeah, that wouldn't be on a valid warrant. It doesn't have an address on it. And the signature is an INS official. It's not a judge. So this warrant is fake or invalid rather. It's would not allow ICE to enter your home without your permission. Okay, another one. Is this a valid warrant? So at the top, it says Superior Court of California, County of Humboldt, search warrant, has some information, it says places to be searched, basically see attached. It has a date from 2016. It has a judge of the Superior Court signed it. And then at the bottom is an affidavit by a police officer. So this is likely a valid warrant, but there are some issues. And to be fair, this was something I found on the internet, so it was probably valid at the time it was issued in 2016. But today, if someone showed up with this warrant in 2020, this would not be good enough because it was issued in 2016. However, it is from the Superior Court of California. It does say search warrant, it doesn't say immigration warrant, and it's signed by a judge. And it doesn't have a specific name or address. It says like see attached. So you'd have to like flip through the pages and make sure that it had your name and address. But if it didn't, this would not be a valid warrant, even though it's signed by a judge. So you gotta be careful for those little nitpicky things. Okay, one more. So this one says Superior Court of California, search warrant and affidavit, issuing date October 27th, 2020, location, there's a name and address. It looks like it was issued yesterday and signed by J. Warren Gunderson. Okay, this is a valid warrant, assuming it was signed by a real person and not someone I made up, but issued by the Superior Court, called a search warrant, not an immigration warrant, issued yesterday. So today, this would still be valid likely. It has my name and my work address on it. So they could come to that address. It's all correct. And it's signed by a judge. And I put this example this way with the J dot, because sometimes judges will be identified that way. J dot stands for judge. So this is Judge Warren Gunderson. And sometimes that can be confusing, but that is a judge. If their name starts with J dot, that is a real judge, most likely, and the warrant is probably valid. Cool, I hope that was helpful. Now I want to talk a little bit about other sort of ruses that ICE can try to pull to try to apprehend people. So sometimes they'll pretend to be like IRS officials or local police who are investigating a crime, or saying that someone's identity was stolen and they're investigating it, or just say not really disclosing who they are, not really saying like, I'm an ICE officer, please come talk to me. So this is just like a caution that anytime any kind of law enforcement officer seeks you out or talks to you at all, be cautious. Demand to know what agency they work for and their badge number, who they are, before agreeing to talk to them. More, sometimes they might use the phone to do some of these as well. So if you get phone calls from police or phone calls about a lost ID, for example, or a crime investigation, asking for some kind of physical like meetup between the two of you, that's suspicious. They could be using these as a way to set up a time to apprehend you, or they could be using it to get information about someone else. So be careful about receiving calls like that. Also in person, again, they can pretend to be local police, and often they might be in plain clothes, even like not in uniform. So if you suspect, it's okay to ask. It's safe to ask and demand more information. So I have a couple of videos that I would love to share. These are role plays by actors acting out different ICE encounters. And I think it's really helpful to see what it actually looks like. So I'm going to play each of these. They're really short. Oh, now I have to share this screen. Let me see this. Okay, I'm gonna stop share and then, oh no, here we go. Share. Okay, you should be able to see my YouTube now. So I'm gonna play this first one. This is an ICE encounter at the front door.
Lisa, can you also? Sure, no. 1 second. What is it? This is Immigration Customs Enforcement. Can you open this door? Yeah? It's ICE. Should I open it? No. Okay. I can open it? Alright, can you please share me to ask you a few questions? Do I know what? You brought away, yes? This is my name. This is Sunlight Justice as well. So please go under the door so I can open it. I'm standing right under the door. Please sign this paper. It's not a proper word. It's not my name. It's Sunlight Justice. I know what to speak with you, answer your questions, or hear you any documents based on my paper languages in the United States Constitution. I'm not given permission to enter my home based on my court in the United States Constitution. I have a warrant to enter, signed by a judge or a magistrate, with my name on it, based on the door. I'm not given permission to search any of my belongings based on my paper languages. Exercise my constitutional rights. You just witnessed an ICE agent at you. What do? First, they tell you to make a call. circumstances of police. So make sure to ask them what agency they're from. Ask her one. Make sure the warrant has your name and that it is signed by a judge. Now, if the warrant does not have your name and it is not signed by a judge, hand them the red card stating your rights. Always keep the red card in a place that's easy to access. If the warrant does have your name and it is signed by a judge, step outside, closing the door behind you, but you should not expose others in the house. Remember, do not say anything or sign anything without first consulting with an attorney.
We'll do the second video, and this one. The second video is a workplace encounter.
Actually, no. This is essentially a response to the testimony. Everybody is safe working environment for all.
Oh, sorry, can y'all not hear it at all? Okay, well, I'll finish playing it then, and we'll see.
Regardless of national origin or religion. We'll see about that. Try to stay late tonight so we can hang out together. Also use the background for the next questions so that each of you
Subtitles are a great suggestion while writing. All right. I don't know how to stop sharing on this screen. I'm gonna stop share and then share again. All right, I hope that's back to the presentation. So I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail about the red cards that you saw the man use in the first video. He read from it while ICE was at his door, and it basically laid out his rights. So these cards are available from our office. They're also available for free online, many places. So it's a good idea to print one of these out from here, from the internet, or get one from us if you can see us. It might be a little hard to get one physically right now because of COVID, but printing it out is totally fine too. You can hand it to the official and remain completely silent. You can also read it as the person in the video did. And it just has a reminder in both English and Spanish of all of your rights and what you need to say. So the most important thing that you can do after you've sort of internalized these things about knowing your rights is making sure that you're apprised of all of ICE activity in your area, because often there are a lot of organizations that track this sort of thing. So I've put some links here to things that will be helpful, announcements from some immigration organizations of ICE enforcement actions, that a link to the red card, making a family preparedness plan, which we'll talk about in a minute, and some more videos that might be helpful for you and your family. And then if you do witness ICE activity, wherever you are, you can call, text, or email me and the AB 540 Center, and we can sort of help assess how to respond. And there's also in the Sacramento area, there's a rapid response hotline. I've given the number here that takes reports. So if you see something, you can report it at this hotline. And there's more rapid response resources that I've linked there. Okay, so making a family preparedness plan is a very important part of making sure everyone in your family is on the same page, and sort of every aspect of your life has been accounted for in the event that you are detained by ICE. So this is an incomplete list, but I've provided some links at the bottom to more resources about how to develop this plan, and it'll look a little different for everyone because we all have different aspects of our lives to take care of. So the first thing is knowing your rights, attending these trainings, remembering, practicing, having a red card, having numbers saved in your phone, memorizing some numbers if you feel that would help you. The second is talking to an immigration attorney if you are undocumented. And it's helpful to know the phone number of an immigration attorney that you can call if you are detained. If you have children or there are children in your family, having a plan for their care is very important. And there's a lot of resources on what you can do to develop these plans. Of course, you want to know who is going to take care of your children if you're absent, and sort of adjust your life now to make it easy and seamless for them to take over care in the event of an emergency. So it's important that your children are involved, know what's going on, if they're old enough to be involved in that, and that other family members are looped in as well. Also gathering important documents for your child, such as care information, school information, medical information, things like that, that backup caregiver can have and reference. In California, there's something called a caregiver's authorization affidavit. That is something you can prepare that allows another adult to assume responsibility for your child in the event of your absence. So it's not quite as serious as, like, you might have heard of a power of attorney or a guardianship or anything like that. This is only for California residents, and it just says, like, if I'm detained or otherwise unavailable, X person can make decisions for my children. And then you want to, for that person who's going to care for your children, you want to make sure that the child's emergency contact information is updated, like at school or at their doctor, so that the person who's taking care of your children doesn't have issues communicating with those people. It's also important that you gather and have a file of important documents that you might need, including all of your immigration documents, any leases or things like that, birth certificates, whatever it is, that's in a safe place, that you know where it is, it's all together, because that could be very important for your immigration case, and it can cause a lot of problems if you can't find some of those documents when you need them. There are also steps you can take to protect financial assets, such as homes. You don't want to default on your mortgage because you can't pay it while you're in detention or anything like that. And there's more details about that in some of the resources I've linked at the bottom. And then also, I just want to note that due to some recent and unfortunate policy changes, there are consequences if you cannot prove that you've been in the US for more than 2 years when you've been detained by ICE. And this might mean assembling things like leases for the last 3 years, or, if you're in college, a transcript from elementary school showing that you attended and you've been here since you were 8 or whatever it is. So if you have been in the US for longer than 2 years, it's important to already have prepared proof of that so that you don't get subject to expedited removal, it's called, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so now I want to take a break and then dive into some more information about detention and deportation. And I just wanted to put another content warning because this can be heavy as well. We're getting into sort of like the nitty-gritty details of what it means to be detained and deported. So if this isn't, you know, your vibe today, feel free to log off and come back to this later. That's totally fine. But for now, we are going to take a break for just a few minutes and then come back. So I'm going to leave this up. I'm going to turn off my camera for a moment. Join us. I just wanted to sort of let you know where we are. So we're about to dive into, I'll just go back. Sorry. We're about to dive into some details about the experience of detention and deportation. So I wanted to share this content warning that it might be a little heavy, and everyone should feel free to log off or close video at any time. You'll have access to this information later to reference if you need to. Okay. So we are going to dive into the process of being detained, what it sort of practically looks like, how to locate family members who have been detained when you're outside trying to find your family member, and then sort of what happens with deportation, who gets deported, how do you get deported, things like that. So first, it's important to know that there are 3 different immigration enforcement agencies, all under the Department of Homeland Security, which is an executive agency of the United States government. So there's a Secretary of Homeland Security that sits on the president's cabinet. And under that is USCIS, US Citizenship and Information Services, which mostly does form processing and affirmative applications for immigration relief and things like that. There's Customs and Border Protection, which is like TSA at the airport, like people you encounter when you're crossing a border. And then Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, who we think of as like the immigration police. They're people who are actual enforcement agents who go out and arrest people. So you could have immigration interactions with any or all 3 of these organizations. So what can one expect in immigration detention? On the right, this is a picture of all the immigration detention facilities in the US. There are many. Many of them are privately owned. They're private prisons. And the conditions vary widely. So immigration detention is indefinite civil detention. It's not actually the same as criminal prison. Just because you've gone to immigration detention doesn't mean that you have a criminal record or that you have been convicted of a crime or anything like that. It's actually unique in that way, that it's for a civil, like a non-criminal offense. So the people who are detained in immigration detention are those who are in removal proceedings or who have already been ordered deported. And it's any non-citizen is subject to this. So it's possible to detain anyone other. And in some cases, it's actually mandatory that people are detained if someone is convicted of a certain crime, like particularly serious crimes, or are going into immigration detention directly out of criminal detention. So if you come from prison and then directly to ICE, you will be mandatorily detained, unfortunately. So how do you find someone who has been detained? Because oftentimes it's very difficult. It's not clear where someone's being held because there's so many different detention facilities, as we saw on that map. You can click on this. I've left the link here. There's a detainee locator that is supposed to have information about everybody and where they're located right now. So an attorney who represents that individual who is being detained can also contact ICE or a family member. So, I mean, the best person would be like a parent or a spouse or a child could call the correct ICE ERO field office to get that information as well. But people tend to be moved around a lot, especially right at the beginning. So someone could spend, just 12 hours at one place and then be moved somewhere else, and then maybe even move somewhere else. So if you are looking for someone in detention, you thought you'd located them, but now you're having trouble getting in touch, it's a good practice to check frequently, especially at the beginning, because people do get moved around a lot for seemingly no reason. It's very unclear who makes these decisions or why. It's also important that kind of like criminal prison, not much is given for free to detainees. So if you have the resources, it's very helpful to put money into a commissary account or a prepaid phone account so that you can have open lines of communication with that individual, and so that they can access things that they might need while they're in detention. And just like in prison, visiting hours are limited, and they might vary by detention location. So you want to make sure you know that if you want to visit someone. But your attorney always has, not your attorney, their attorney, the detainee's attorney, always can access that person. So an attorney has a right to open communication with the detainee at all times for purposes of legal representation. So if you can help your loved one who's inside connect with an attorney and get representation, it helps a lot. It's a really unjust situation that a lot of people are left in when they have no contacts on the outside and no access to an attorney to help them navigate the system. It's something I hope changes, but in the world we live in today, this is the reality, and it's good to be prepared and understand what you might face and have sort of those important phone numbers and things memorized. Okay, so deportation can happen after detention, or it can happen without you ever being detained. So it's important to know, I think we kind of have like a cultural vision of people being deported as, ICE comes and like grabs you off the street and puts you on a plane and you fly, and the next day you're in another country, maybe somewhere you've never been before, that you haven't been in years. That rarely happens. It's kind of a misconception what deportation looks like. Very few people are apprehended and immediately deported back to their country of origin. It does happen, mostly to very, very recent arrivals, but most likely that is not what deportation will look like for individuals who've been here for a while. So if you've been in the US for more than 2 years and you've never had a prior deportation order, you've never been to immigration court or anything like that, you have a right to have a hearing before an immigration judge before being deported. And these cases can take years to adjudicate everything and fill out all the forms and have your hearing and have your continuance and talk to your attorney and talk to your judge. It can take a really long time. Meanwhile, hopefully you're just living your life outside of the court. You're probably having check-ins either with your immigration judge or with an immigration enforcement official. But most deportations happen after a very, very long deportation process. If you've been in the US for less than 2 years, you may be subject to expedited removal. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. This is why it's very important to have evidence of the fact that you've been in the US for more than 2 years, if you have, because if you can't prove that, you might be subject to expedited removal, which is a quicker process, not a full hearing before an immigration judge, really without due process at all. It's still a procedure, so it still takes a little bit of time. It's not immediate, but it is expedited. So it does go by a lot faster and is a lot less friendly. So yeah. And then the same applies also if you have a prior deportation order. The deportation order will be reinstated and you'll be removed. And again, that takes some time. It takes some time for all this bureaucracy to go through. So it's not going to be the next day, but it's a lot easier for them to carry out a deportation if there's a prior deportation order that was ever in place against an individual. And it varies also by country. So Mexico is the largest country as far as numbers of deportations. So if the individual is a citizen of Mexico, the deportation can take place within 24 or 48 hours. So that can be quite quick. But if it's a different country, it might be more difficult to arrange a deportation under those circumstances. Some countries don't accept deportees. They don't, or some people are stateless and have no citizenship, in which case it might be impossible to deport them anywhere. And in those cases, some people end up staying here for a long, long time, even though they have an order of deportation in place. And the only way to stop a deportation with a prior removal order is if you fear harm or torture in your home country. So again, never lie to an immigration official. Don't make up a story. But if you are afraid that you will be subject to harm or torture, if you're deported, it's important to express that, because that can be a reason for you to stay in the US. That can mean you're afraid of being targeted because of one of your identities, or maybe the place you're being deported to, you might be subject to gang violence or another kind of violence, or persecution by the government or something. If you are afraid due to harm or torture that you might be subject to, you should express that, and it could be a reason to delay or avoid deportation. So each person who is in deportation proceedings is assigned a deportation officer. They will interact with you, talk to you, try to get information about your immigration history. And these interactions, you want to be careful about the kinds of information that you disclose. So you don't want to disclose your country of origin, which might seem, kind of weird, because it's pretty easy to find out where you're from, but admitting that you have a country of origin elsewhere can lead to some legal issues, as far as sometimes it can be taken as an admission that you are in the US illegally. So to be safe, just don't admit it. Just say, I don't want to respond. Again, don't volunteer information about your immigration history or your criminal history. This is a common theme. Never volunteer information. Make them work for it, because it can only hurt you to provide information that you don't have to provide. As I said, do tell the deportation officer if you fear returning to your country of origin due to torture or harm. Do tell them about US citizen family members, especially close family members, because that may be a basis to avoid deportation as well. Do tell them about serious medical conditions or the need for treatment, because they are responsible for your care while you are in detention, and so they have to provide the medical care that you need. And then do ask for bond, which is a discretionary thing that we will talk about. I think it's the next, so bond is very important, and you have to affirmatively ask for it. You have to say, I would like a bond hearing, please. And this bond it's like a bail in prison. So it allows people who are not detained to pay some amount of money that's set by the court to allow you to be released until your deportation hearing actually happens. So it can be paid by any adult who has an ID, and it must be paid by a cashier's check, or a money order at an ICE ERO location. But in order to get bond, you have to have a bond hearing. The minimum amount that it could be is $1,500. There's no maximum, unfortunately. So sometimes it can be very expensive, but the minimum is $1,500, and it can be denied for some reasons if an immigration judge doesn't believe that bond is a good idea. And while you are out on bond, if you do secure a bond and you pay it and you get out, ICE may impose some alternatives to detention. We've seen them do a lot of ankle monitors recently. So you might be out, but you still are being tracked. And yeah, so it's important to ask for bond. Wonderful if you get it and you're able to pay, but you will still have a deportation hearing. So who gets bond and how do you argue for it? Bond it's discretionary. It can be denied based on any of these three reasons. If you're considered a danger to the community, which is often based on like a criminal history, or any kinds of like events that make the individual seem dangerous, unless you can show that you've rehabilitated yourself or otherwise you're not a danger for some reason. The second is flight risk. This means like the judge is worried that the individual might not appear at their hearing unless they're detained. Having a history of not appearing at court hearings is evidence that you might be at flight risk. So for that reason, it's very important to go to all sort of legal hearings that you might have. But you can try to argue against this if you had like a reason not to go, maybe you didn't get notice or something. But flight risk is a big reason why people often are denied bond. And then the final one is reasonable detention. The judge might think detention is reasonable without bond if your deportation is scheduled for 3 days from now, or there's no immigration relief available and you're in expedited removal or something. So it is very much left up to the judge, and unfortunately that's true of a lot of things in immigration, but at least in immigration enforcement and removal and deportation. Immigration judges vary wildly in how they apply these standards and sort of what assumptions they make. Some judges will lean towards giving everyone bond unless it's an extreme circumstance, and others will lean more towards being suspicious and not giving people bonds, unfortunately. So it really depends, but knowing these things can help you prepare for the kinds of arguments you might have to make on your own behalf to secure a bond if that's something that you want. Okay. So deportation proceedings, this is when you're actually going before the judge, an immigration judge, to determine whether or not you should be deported. So immigration court is administrative court. It's different from a judicial court in the US. That means it's a little bit less formal. It's a little bit more discretionary, a little bit less objective, maybe. And as I said, it varies so much, partly because of that, because these aren't lifetime appointed judges. They're more career judges who go in and out of the job. So they determine who is deportable or inadmissible. So whether or not you're able to be admitted to the US or whether or not you can affirmatively be removed from the US. This is in the Executive Office for Immigration Review. That's the administrative agency. Yeah, and it is in an actual courtroom. So yeah. In the hearing, the process is the burden of proof is on the government. So that means that the government must prove by clear and convincing evidence that an individual is deportable. So technically, it's not your job if you end up in immigration court to prove that you have a right to stay. It's the government's job to prove that they have a right to remove you. So that's important to keep in mind. There's no right to a free attorney, which is not like criminal court. In the criminal system in the US, everyone has a right to a free criminal defense attorney. But in immigration court, you have a right to counsel. You can have an attorney, but you have to find the attorney and maybe pay for them unless you can find free counsel. Usually, if you don't have an attorney but you want one, you can ask for a continuance from the judge, which means pushing your case back to give you more time to find an attorney. And usually they'll grant you one continuance. If you do not show up to your deportation hearing, an in absentia removal order is issued. And that can have a lot of consequences. So it's important to show up if you do have a deportation hearing scheduled, because otherwise it's basically a forfeit, the hearing. Okay. So there's two types of immigration court. There's detained immigration court and non-detained immigration court. So detained is for people who are in immigration detention. Usually it's detained immigration court moves a lot faster because there's the risk of violating people's rights if you keep them in detention for too long. So they try to prioritize those people and move them through the system faster. Usually it's people who have very recently arrived, and then people who have been detained due to criminal convictions. So people who were in prison or jail and then were transferred to ICE custody. And again, you can request bond in those circumstances. And if you get bond, you can also request to have your case transferred to non-detained court, which, as I said, is a little slower, takes a little longer, which can be an advantage for people who want to just keep living their lives as long as they can. So non-detained immigration court is for most people who don't have a criminal history, who have been released on bond, who have applied for some kind of immigration relief and are just waiting, things like that. And yeah, it goes slower. Okay, so that's everything about detention and deportation. Happy to take questions about it at the end or clarifications. But I also want to talk a little bit about information specifically for UCD students, and share some resources as well. So the Sacramento Fuel Network is a really cool coalition of organizations in Sacramento that offer free services to immigrant communities, people seeking legal services particularly. And they also operate this rapid response hotline, which I mentioned earlier for reporting ICE activity. You can also call this you can also call this hotline to get connected to free legal representation for an immigration case if we need it. AB 60 is, excuse me, is a California bill that allows undocumented individuals to obtain driver's licenses in California, which you can use to drive and use as an ID generally, but you can't use it as an ID in federal buildings or for air travel like at TSA. If you have one of these driver's licenses, you should not show it to ICE or any other immigration enforcement agency, because it can act as sort of a disclosure of your immigration status. And then also it is advisable to speak with an attorney before applying, especially if you have any sort of criminal history, because you might want to weigh some pros and cons of obtaining one of these licenses. Yes, and then the city of Davis is a sanctuary city. Sanctuary is one of those fluid terms that is technically like a legal term of art. It doesn't have one meaning that can be applied to every city in the US that claims to be a sanctuary city. But in Davis, in the city of Davis, it means that police and city officials won't take immigration status into account when they're provisioning services or interacting with people within the city limits. So no one who works for the city of Davis should ever be asking you about your immigration status. And they should not target you or cooperate with ICE enforcement to target undocumented people. And you can read more about that at that link. The UC, University of California, is also a sanctuary campus or a sanctuary system. UC and UC Davis specifically both have policies committing our campuses to making our institutions open for learning and safe for everyone. So the UCD police also will not engage with immigration enforcement like the UC or like the Davis police. So if you're in Davis, if you're on campus, you should be safe to interact with city police or campus police without fear of immigration consequences from just talking to them. And I have some links there where you can read more. AB 21 makes some requirements related to immigration for UC employees. So staff, faculty, anyone who works for a UC. This is just an overview. You can go online and read more about the specific language, but UC employees may not release or discuss the immigration status of any student, faculty, or staff member, including or except discussions with the individual themselves. If we see any suspected ICE activity on campus, we have to notify the chancellor and confidentially notify any students who might be vulnerable to ICE activity on campus. We have to verify that ICE warrants and subpoenas are valid before complying with them. So just like before we talked about warrants, all UC employees are obligated to make sure they're correct before allowing ICE to search anything. And also, each department has to assign staff as a point of contact for students subject to immigration enforcement. And then a common question, can ICE be on campus? And since the University of California, Davis is a public university, like all the UCs, ICE is allowed to access some parts of campus because ICE can go anywhere the public can go. So the quad on campus, maybe the gym or the library, anywhere that's open to the public is open to ICE as well, just as individuals going about their day. But there are some private parts of campus. Anywhere that's private or access controlled, ICE must have a warrant to enter. So that's offices, dorms, anywhere private like that. And ICE also may come to campus for non-enforcement immigration reasons, for example, job recruitment or some programs on campus that they're involved in. So seeing ICE on campus doesn't always mean that they're there to arrest people or do immigration enforcement actions. If you do see ICE or DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, on campus, the first thing I would say is don't panic. Let Nacho at the 8540 Center or me know, so we can verify the activity and notify the people who need to know and organize around it. There's an FAQ that I've linked there to learn about that. And I will just say that the times in the past few years that we've had people let us know about ICE activity on campus, it's actually been Department of Homeland Security officials, so not enforcement, just people who work in the department coming to campus, which totally worth telling us about. But it hasn't been ICE enforcement activity, so that hasn't happened very much, if at all. So happy to take questions or feedback. Very, very interested in what was helpful, what was not helpful, what else you might want to know. And then here's our contact information. And I encourage everybody who isn't documented and hasn't had an immigration screening with us to schedule a consultation at that link right there. I will hang out for a little bit to see if anyone has questions. Thanks everybody for coming.
Yes, thank you, Ariel, so much for this awesome presentation. I learned about so many resources that I didn't know about. And I feel like the examples discussed really allowed me to visualize these situations. So thank you.
Yeah, and I encourage also anyone, yeah, super glad. And we're gonna, as I said earlier, we're gonna send the recording around. So anyone who